Today, we continue to build our foundation for the practice of spiritual disciplines, and the topic I want to look at today is dependence, not achievement. So, the goal of the disciplines is very counterintuitive to many of us, and I would include myself in that number. It's because it's not about something that you achieve. You do not outgrow your need from God, like a child outgrows their need for their parent, but rather you become rather than like a child growing up becoming more independent, you actually become more dependent through the practice of the spiritual disciplines. And like I said, it's not how anything else in our life works. That the more that I ride my bike, the easier it becomes. The more money I have in the bank, the less dependent I am on a thing like a job. And so today, I want to look at just 3 T's to help us understand what our goal is in the practice of spiritual disciplines. And those 3 T's are transaction, theosis, and then teach. So transaction. Almost every relationship in our life functions on the level of transaction. You need money, so you get a job. You need to eat, so you give that money to a grocery store. Transactions are based on a mutual need, and each side offers something to meet that need. And that works great in the world of commerce. But unfortunately, more of our relationships than we would like to admit are transactional on a personal level. The fact that we offer to love people to meet a need in our life has built the mansion of innumerable self-help authors. We call it relational dysfunction. And this relational dysfunction often carries over into our relationship with God. We often ask, what does God need us to do? And let me say this. God does not need you. Hear me say it again. God does not need you. Now, if that stings a bit, and it does for me, consider the source of the sting. It's that when we hear someone say they do not need us, we translate that as they do not love us, because we so conflate need and love. And so for me to say to you that God does not need you can often sound like me saying that God does not love you. But while most of our relationships are transactional, our relationship with God is not. It's not defined by transaction, it's defined by grace. And that's what makes it so very, very radical, and also so very, very hard to accept. But grace tells us that God needs nothing from us, and yet he gives us everything. And he does this because he loves us. So now maybe that the sting is past, consider the beauty and freedom being offered to you by God. He loves you unconditionally. He saves you not because he needs to or has to, but because he wants to. What motivates God in his relationship to you is love. And so the spiritual disciplines are not about a transactional relationship. We do not give something to God and he rewards us. The disciplines are about love. And that brings us to our second T, theosis. And another word for that is deification. And this phrase can be found in it's a limited amount, but there are some early patristic fathers, church fathers, who wrote about this. And it really has become a central theme in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And the basic premise is that in union with Christ, we are transformed. And that's great. Like, I hear that and I believe that to be in the presence of God is to be transformed. That is the nature of his goodness, his holiness, and his love. And practices like centering prayer, which I practiced, they were sort of recently made popular in the West, like recent in terms of church history, right? So in like the last, I think, 75 years. There were two monks. Thomas Keating wrote a lot about it, and then Thomas Merton was another one who popularized it. They brought these practices back into the mainstream of Western Christianity, and that's a really helpful thing because that's something that we lost in the East-West schism. But here's where it goes a little wonky. It goes wonky when you make theosis a matter of becoming like God, and what they mean by this is not that you are restored to the sinless state like Adam and Eve. And when I say they, I'm talking about some of the Eastern Church theology around this. Is they're not saying that you become like God and that you're holy, But through the practices of theosis, there are that you are made into a God. So that's the idea of deification, right? And so through the practices of theosis, that there are parts of you that are now so holy that you no longer need God. And that's when the whole thing goes off the rails from being a helpful practice to just outright heresy. And here's why. Foundational to Christianity is that God is God and we are not. He is the creator and we are the created. Our goal is not to become a God, but to become what he has created us to be. And who we are created to be is human beings. And human beings were made to be dependent on God. Let me say this again. Our dependence upon God is not a matter of the fall, but it is how God made us. And so your dependence on God is not a result of sin. Your dependence on God is not a result of weakness. Your dependence on God is actually a sign of your holiness, because it is you living more and more into who God has made you to be. And that brings us to the final T, teach. And so what is God trying to teach us through the spiritual disciplines? It is that growing your faith looks less like independence and more like dependence. That maturing is not needing God less and less, but realizing the depth of your need for him. Now, while it's not about achievement, there are some basic stages that you can talk about with faith. And they're helpful just to remind you, because I'm sure you've heard them before, but it helps us keep things clear in our head. There is justification. It is where we are saved by grace through the finished work of Christ on the cross. And then there's our sanctification. And this is the process by which we live more and more into our justification. And this is really, really important, because what it says is that justification is still central to our growing in faith, right? That how we grow in our faith is a continual returning to our justification, which is the work of Christ, not the work that we do. And then finally, there's our glorification. And notice that's different language than our deification. Glorification is that we are restored to who we were made to be in the garden, with one notable exception. And this is what I think some of these theosis guys were trying to figure out, and where they may have got a little wrong. That every indication is that in the new heavens and the new earth, unlike Adam and Eve, we will be unable to fall, right? So this ability to sin, the more positive way to put it is that we will never sin again. And it's not that we lose our free will, but this is one of the blessed fruits of our justification, of our redemption. And so justification is all about the work of Christ. Sanctification is all about our justification, which is about the work of Christ, as we already said. Glorification is all about our justification as well. It is because glorification is where we see the fullness of our justification. And that's what Paul means when he talks about finishing the race or working out our faith with fear and trembling. Not that we're earning our justification, but that we're living into it more and more and more. And that in the new heavens and the new earth, we see the fullness of the promise of our justification. It also means that until Christ's return, we live in a state called sumo ostis epikator, and you've heard me use that before. It's that we are simultaneously justified and sinful. And to live in this state without falling into absolute despair about your justification, right? Because you're like, I'm justified. I've been set free from my sin. I've been given from a new life. So why am I still struggling with this sin? It's so easy to fall into that trap of hopelessness and despair. What sumo estis epikator, which is based on Paul's language of there's a war that goes on within us between the flesh and the spirit. What it tells you is that you can, in fact, not stop sinning until your glorification. But that this is not a reflection that you have somehow lost that you've lost your justification, or that sanctification is not occurring in your life. It is to simply say that we live in a kingdom, in a promise that is here, but not fully realized yet. And so the goal really in the spiritual disciplines is not this theosis type idea where we become so holy that we stop sinning, but that we become so holy that we realize we are more and more dependent upon God. It's about dependence, not achievement. And so it's about your justification, not your deification. It's not about the law. It's all about grace.